Hello and welcome back to the SecurityMetrics podcast. My name is Jen Stone. I'm one of the principal security analysts here at SecurityMetrics. And today we're going to talk a little bit about cloud security. Let me talk to you about our guest. Chase Pettet is the Chief Security Architect at Archer Integrated Risk Management. It's an RSA security company. And Chase is a distinguished security professional, partner, advocate, architect, engineer, people manager, and data security enthusiast. He has an emphasis on risk-informed decision-making, automation, tactical optimism, I love that, and fostering healthy cultures of collaboration to help build and grow successful initiatives across industries. Chase has worked for companies behind globally ranked top 10 and 150 websites for a decade in these capacities, as well as highly regulated environments for an additional decade. This includes HIPAA, PCI DSS, FISMA, and ISO 27001. Chase is a lifelong builder and continuous learner who can often be found in the workshop. He lives in the Midwestern portion of the United States with his wife and 2 daughters. Chase, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Yes, appreciate it.
So tell me, before we jump into the topic, tell me a little bit of your background. How did you get to be here in your career? Where did you start? A lot of people like to know, what's the avenue that takes them to being a security professional like you?
I wanted to be a network engineer. I thought that was like the top of the mountain at one point, and I was really fascinated by it. So I did that. And then I was at places where it was always pretty valuable if you had a primary skill and then a secondary, or even a couple of secondaries.
Mm-hmm.
And I did network and infrastructure, and then network and Linux infrastructure, and then security kind of crept in on all those fronts. And I was at a series of places where no one really held like a official distinct security title. And so I inherited more and more and more of it until I was at a place where I just finally made the leap and started doing nothing but that. And it's been going well.
Excellent. I often have people ask me, how do I get into security? What's a good starting place? And I tell them an excellent entry-level position for security is IT. Learning about the basics of how architecture works in a network, how to build that, how to manage it, how to make sure you've got your patches, on the various things. And that doesn't always, it seems like obvious to me that IT would be a great starting point. Networking is a great starting point. Systems management as well, system administration, good starting point. But that doesn't always seem like obvious to people who are interested in security. But if you understand that as a background, it gives you kind of a basis for learning how to protect the things.
Yeah, depending on kind of what arena in the broad umbrella of security you find interesting, you're going to find yourself relating those concepts just every day.
Right.
And so having a pretty broad background in them really helps.
Yeah.
It really kind of accelerates your, you get dropped into a situation, you have to orient yourself, and that's a big boon from that front.
Yeah. And risk management, it seems like regardless of how you apply risk management, understanding just where to start with on it is a good jumping off point.
Yeah, I mean, risk management is such a long and storied topic that goes back so much further than IT. And some of the kind of youngness of the industry, the youth, is running into some of the more established industries. And so financial risk management is kind of starting to overlap with IT. And so I find that to be a really meaningful subset of just language and skills in terms of running information security programs. I want to say the words at scale, but in a way that's integrated with the business at a place where it's more than a few hundred people. That's the language of it, to my experience.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes we use language in odd ways in security, or even specifically in compliance. That's intended to create security. That we use words that mean so many things, and you kind of have to know which one you're talking about. Let's take the word segregation. Like
Right.
let's say you're trying to keep credit card data secure, and so you're doing the PCI standard, and you're supposed to segment a network, a subnetwork from other things in order to declare your scope. Well, segment can mean so many things depending on who's using the word and in what way.
Yeah, I've worked with a couple of different places that were very international, right? And some of the best engineers I've ever worked with, English is not their second language. And I am blown away by people who can have high level conceptual conversations in a second language,
Yeah.
especially when you're reusing words and descriptors that have multiple meanings and have a lot of nuance to it. Really kind of speaks to the necessity of shared language.
Yeah.
And then, like the need for common ground. So
Right.
I find that really fascinating.
And I think that, to your point, the common ground, the more experience you have as a security professional, if you want to talk to the people who are hands-on, making the things happen, you kind of have to have a background, technical, at least a little bit, to understand what they're saying. And then you want to take and apply that to the decision making from the C-suite. Well, you have to also understand where they're coming from with the same words, but maybe little slightly different connotations, right?
Yeah, definitely having been in the mix. I was actually thinking about this earlier or yesterday. Some of the operations folks I talk to right now are, kind of a rock and a hard place thing. And I've been in that hard place at other gigs. And so I have almost like a visceral understanding in my chest of like what it feels like to feel kind of caught in the middle between competing constraints. And I do feel like that pushes me to go a little farther, to empathize and try to find the solution that works for everyone, because I don't take it personally. And I don't think, like people who are responsible for keeping a system up and stable, sometimes, the ultimate polarity there is like making progress, change versus stability.
Right.
And the people on both sides of that equation have a good intent, and you just really have to work it out and keep it not personal and relate it back to, a thing that I tell myself is I'm not trying to find the best solution. I'm trying to find the best solution given the constraints of the situation, which maybe sounds, I don't know, like I'm wriggling out from underneath something, but it just, to me, means there might be a technical mountaintop, but that's not necessarily what can happen in any given situation. And if you're really fixated on something that's unrealistic, you can cause way more harm than good.
Yeah. No, I don't think that that's an unrealistic way to put it at all. Taking things into account and finding the best way isn't always the most technical way, or the most, if you're trying to solve all security, that means you don't have any communication, right? So it's
Sure.
always a balance between, as you said, competing constraints. What do you want to have happen, and how do you want to have that happen? And what is best for one organization might not be the same for another. And it kind of depends on your environment. So that brings us to the actual topic for today, which is cloud security. So what's changed? What's the same? I know originally when organizations started moving from on-prem to cloud solutions, that was a big conceptual leap, and not everybody made that leap. A lot of organizations took what they had in their on-prem solution and just rebuilt it in the cloud. Some organizations, the IT folks were a little concerned that, what's going to happen to my job if what I do now transfers to the cloud? First of all, what do you think's driving this shift to the cloud? And do you think it is all one way at this point? Are we all moving to the cloud, or is there a shift coming backwards? What's that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, there's a couple of big cycles, It's like I've noticed that large scrunchies are back. My daughters are wearing them, and those were big in the early 90s. And so
Yeah,
it makes me think about like the push and pull between local compute and like mainframe compute,
sure.
like time renting versus buying something and depreciating it over time, like which one's more efficient. And it
Right.
just seems like things push and pull back and forth. So I don't think it's ever going to be one way. I've heard folks say like there's no reason to ever run your own on-prem cloud or whatever.
Hmm.
That seems way too broad
Yeah.
to me. I can think of a number of situations where it probably makes the most sense. But in terms of like moving to the cloud, it's interesting because we don't always think of SaaS as like part of the cloud migration story, at least when we're talking in technical terms. Like most people I talk to immediately jump to infrastructure as a service
Hmm.
as like their kind of anchor. But really the push towards SaaS solutions, and I don't want to say the loosening of data sovereignty, but sort of defining what it means for other people to hold your data and what the safeguards are.
Right.
That has been part of the it's like I read a meme that said something like in the 90s it was don't talk to strangers on the internet, don't ride with strangers, and now it's like order a stranger in an app so that you can ride in their car.
Yeah.
And there's been a similar kind of loosening of norms in terms of what happens if I disseminate my data out? How do I protect it? How do I account for that? And I think some of that is SaaS and the appetite for that. And then it kind of works backwards into the more technical realms of we want to do infrastructure as a service. We want to do platform as a service.
Hmm.
I'm talking a lot, so please interject if
This
I
is
need
great.
to.
Well, I think
Okay.
one thing is that most of our listeners understand that SaaS is software as a service, but
Okay.
I think one of the things we should do is talk about what do we mean by that, and in what way would we be sharing our data with a SaaS solution. There's a couple that I can think of like really quickly, which is, well, are you taking care of your own logs, monitoring and alerting? Do you have your own security operations center that's taking care of all that, or are you shipping your logs to a third-party organization that's keeping an eye on things for you, right? That
Totally.
could be software as a service. That could be another would be EHR, which is electronic health records, right? That's a really big one because originally people said, no, you can't take PHI, protected health information. You cannot put that in the cloud, right? That was a huge one that people thought
Yeah.
you could never do that. And now everybody's saying, no, you absolutely can and kind of need to do that. And so, like you said, that it goes back and forth, but sometimes people don't even realize that's what they're doing with some of these big application solutions, right?
Yeah, the FUD has dissipated over time.
Yeah.
It's become sort of less and less resilient to real introspection, and I think some of that's totally valid. The one thing that I really like with Amazon, I love their sort of pictograph of the shared responsibility model, because I think that people understand that. My experience is that is a great jumping off point for we are transferring liability for some things by paying other people to do things we could otherwise accomplish, but we are not abdicating responsibility for our data. We are not abdicating responsibility for our users or our operations.
Right.
And I do feel like some of the cloud marketing copy in the early days was trying to say that without saying it because they knew they couldn't, and it's come back down to reality in some respects, which is good. But okay, so in terms of why are people moving to the cloud, I'll try to circle back here.
Great.
I have this theory a little bit that as the systems become kind of more powerful, more robust, and cheaper, that we are able to optimize for things that are more human.
Right.
So like if you wanted to write a program in the early 90s, in many ways, you were probably dealing with memory constraints. And like a lot of the really cool old PDP stories are the clever use of memory or storage because they were dealing with so many resource constraints. But that has shifted so much that now you're to the place where if you want to hold, n number of copies of a library in a container across your fleet, that's not a burden, really.
Yeah.
And so the storage and the compute, all of that is so ubiquitous that really you can start to optimize for the human element, which, if you backtrack on it enough, is really like the innovation element. And so my thinking on that is cloud in general has been kind of moving towards a improving time to market story and improving time to value rather than like the early days. I heard a lot more about cost optimization. I remember AWS taglines, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years ago, and it was a lot about saving money, finding ways to save money by farming out these problems. And I don't hear that as much anymore.
No.
Now it seems to be much more about not reinventing the wheel, focusing on business differentiators and things that make total sense to me in terms of that shared responsibility model. Like, businesses don't necessarily want to have to build their own roads. They just want cars to transfer things from A to B. And so that's nice generally, especially if you're looking to focus on kind of the business logic of the whole thing. So my take is that it's going to continually move in that direction, just because there's so many economies of scale in terms of a large cloud operation. And really, you could drive down costs, but I don't think that's the driver anymore. That's not what I hear when I'm talking to people who control the budget. It's more about how can we empower faster, better innovation? How can we improve quality? And you can do that through a bunch of patterns that are enabled by certain technical things on the back end, like composable, recreatable environments that you can stand up and blow away. That's a big thing for developers to be able to do, and it really just wasn't possible in the same way even in the early zeros.
Right.
So I think that's why, and I don't think that everybody is moving towards the cloud. I mean, I know a number of large places that they're so big, they have their own economies of scale, and they have their own, special considerations that aren't tied back to the technical elements of things. Like, I used to work at the Wikimedia Foundation. They famously run Wikipedia and a bunch of other projects. And one of the concerns there was privacy and data sovereignty, and who do we trust to be in the middle of users and content, because it's not a mercantile operation, it's a nonprofit. And so maybe there are things in the cloud universe that could have been leveraged stronger or more often, but it was almost always looked at through this kind of privacy advocacy lens. And those are going to be very different technical outcomes once you hit the ground versus what is the most efficient way to process these bits.
Right. And efficiency isn't the only concern. It's a primary concern for some groups. It's not for some other groups. There are, like you said, that sometimes we've got maybe regulatory aspects that have to be considered that make it so that you either can't be in the cloud, or more likely you can't be in the cloud maybe in certain parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So,
yeah.
So when we look at kind of those decisions, I think you're right. Sometimes it's what do these cloud platforms offer that make it easier for the organization to do what they do really well, and offload the stuff that they're not the experts at.
Yeah, and they're really hard, really time consuming, and risky in terms of cost to try to do yourself versus taking the commodified experience of it and then building value on top of that. And plus, the biggest thing that I've heard that I thought was a bit of a light bulb moment for me was talking to a really smart product manager about all of this. And we were talking about data sovereignty and locality, and it was kind of a decision point. And one of the things she said to me was, I just don't want to incur the opportunity cost of building up all of this table stakes infrastructure on our own when we could be using that time to work on the product, the things about what we do that make it different and special. And I was like, bam, let's put that on a shirt.
Absolutely.
You nailed it.
And one of the ways that I'm seeing this is we kind of talked briefly about it a little while ago was, the architecture, how architecture might be different for on-prem solution versus in cloud. I think early on, the in-cloud solutions really looked like on-prem architecture. And when we talk about architecture, this is like someone described it to me once as stuff that's harder and takes longer to change. It's like the underlying structures on which your solution, your product, your data, your application are built, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
And so early on, we really did see, you had your server farm on-prem, and people said, hey, we're going to the cloud. And then they rebuilt their server cloud up in the cloud. so they took all of the things that existed and maybe weren't efficient and just recreated it. But more and more I'm seeing, especially for greenfield applications, people are taking it to the service layer in the cloud. Are you seeing that as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like when I review projects internally where I'm at now, I often describe that as using cloud primitives, like versus building on top of an EC2. And so like we have a push and pull between kind of historic on-prem customers and new SaaS customers. And so when you're looking at features or products or components that need to live in both worlds, you're always kind of finding that happy medium in using what I call cloud primitives, right? Like, Are you going to use Lambda? Are you going to use RDS? Are you going to use things that are kind of value adds of that ecosystem? When you program in Python or some other language, there generally you have the same data structures, the same control structures and all of that. But you also have a bunch of like idioms that are very specific to a language that probably is something that isn't expressed the same way or accomplished the same way in other programming languages, even if the end result is the same. And like it's very similar in the cloud computing context. AWS has certain idioms that make sense there. Google Cloud has certain idioms that make sense there. And so when you are designing something to be really native to that cloud experience, can be efficient and cheaper and everything else. And then you get into portability concerns and it's just part of the process.
This episode is brought to you by SecurityMetrics Shopping Cart Monitor Inspect. It's a revolutionary new product that can help you detect any problems with your shopping cart security, allowing you to effectively improve your e-commerce security. Here's what I know about it. A lot of times people say, well, hey, I am PCI compliant because I passed my SAQA. Great. You're missing most of the things that people are actually stealing information from right now. Shopping Cart Monitor was created to actually close those gaps and help you against things like Magecart and other known e-commerce issues. To learn more about this Shopping Cart Monitor, head to our website, securitymetrics.com. So taking that idea from a security perspective, how do you think the different types of architecture, these different, basic foundational choices, how do you think it affects security?
I kind of think that the move towards programmatic architecture, programmatic infrastructure is maybe the lead that's buried when we talk about cloud, because you don't necessarily have to be using public cloud to have, declarative, programmatically driven infrastructure. But that's sort of the end result if you want to do it well. You could totally build that all in-house prior to kind of the big guys. And in some cases, I did. I'm sure a lot of people built mechanisms for that kind of automation and infrastructure as code way before AWS. And that programmatic, declarative, and then kind of by extension, the composable, repeatable, deterministic nature of infrastructure, and being able to describe a stack, in one place and then repeat it. That has, to me, been kind of the biggest transformation, and it's really hit security in a few different ways. One of them is it's difficult to be a security engineer and not be somewhat educated on at least reading code. Everything is code anymore, at least in most of the environments I operate in. You have to be able to read, Terraform. You probably have read Puppet or Chef. You've thought through, how those things are implemented and how they impact existing projects and other projects that are coming down the pipeline. The other thing that I think is interesting is that in many ways, the anatomy of the field of an information security management system is the same, right? But like, people have legs and crabs have legs, but if you confuse them, you might be in serious trouble depending on the context. And so, for me, like, I've been in environments that are primarily hybrid, and policy was always the same. We had the same policy regardless of context, but then the standards were probably a little different, right? What were we doing? And then the procedure for how to do it was way different. But the policy, the conceptual element, the principles, really, they didn't change. It really came down to the context, which was always true before. But now you have this arena where there's a proliferation of like best standards and practices because it's all shared, right? Like, back when, I remember learning someone's infrastructure, and you would always kind of have to tally what skills would translate to your next job necessarily. Like, maybe you were used to VMware, maybe you weren't. What was the virtualization engine? What were the networking devices in use? Like, it was very much a compartmentalized world in terms of on-prem deployments.
For sure.
And now I see a lot of advertisements that are just like, do you have experience in AWS? Great. You can walk in the door with so much context. It's kind of crazy, just all of the shared concerns. But from an anatomy standpoint of like how I think about running a security program, it's certain layers that are now have contextually specific applications in the cloud arena. If you still have on-prem, or if you have IoT or whatever, they're going to have different standards and procedures. I would say the technical controls are much, much different in terms of what we used to do, both because, it's great that the ground floor has been raised from a development perspective so that it's possible to just write code and run it, and that's the extent of your concern.
Right.
But the same is true in many cases for security, like AWS guardrails, in terms of like multi-account management and all of that, all the things that you can kind of do magic sauce out of the box in that scenario. If you know about it, that would have been so much work to even get that capability in a job 15 years ago, that it's kind of wonderful. And then the flip side of that is, now you are really beholden to the entire life cycle process because things are moving so fast, because declarative infrastructure can be reshaped, redeployed. You have to be so close to kind of the inception of those concepts and models in order to have them secured in place when they manifest. That whereas an ounce of prevention used to be worth a pound of cure. Sorry if you hear my daughter. Now it's like an ounce of prevention is worth 20 pounds of cure, just because of how quickly issues can spiral when You have one service that gets deployed and then another is deployed on top of it, and you get all kinds of interconnected complexity. And like soon the technical debt can become really difficult to reconcile much quicker than it used to, in my experience, at least, just based on how much faster people are innovating and expanding.
Right. That brings up a concept that maybe we can come up with some practical advice for people. A lot of times organizations are in the cloud moving at speed with almost different paradigms in how interconnectedness works, how security works. But a lot of these, and it's almost impossible to unmarry compliance from security, the intent being that compliance creates security, but we know that that's not always necessarily true. And sometimes the compliance is written in ways that is presupposes some of the older paradigms and not the new ones. And so then you can't compound that with, in order to be an assessor, you have to have a lot of experience with various things that you then get plucked out of your experience and become full-time in security. So a lot of the assessors that are coming along might have a gap in knowledge because they went from on-prem knowledge and abilities and now are being required to look at cloud-based models, which of course you can get training, but hands-on is a very different thing. And so if you have a cloud environment where how that some of the questions that you're being asked are almost nonsensical sometimes in terms of the new environment. So this can make people frustrated on both sides, because here you've got an assessor, third party coming in trying to evaluate what you have, might have a gap in knowledge, but also might just have a gap in how you do things, not necessarily just how the cloud does things, but how you specifically are doing that, where the group that is creating it might be so cloud native they don't know how to translate it backwards to that type of language. So do you ever run into this?
Yeah, definitely. I think that this is a new boss, same as the old boss situation in many cases, and I'll attempt to explain what I mean by that. And I'm going to use a real sticky phrase, which is just to start with why. That's been my approach to this, and I've had this sort of ships in the night thing between sort of eras, right, of infrastructure a few times, and it kind of harkens back to doing customer support or developer support in many cases, because security is a support function, to the creation of the product. And so I end up doing, for high level developer support in many cases, how to implement certain scanning or whatever for their code. And it's kind of commonly stated that, I say this with love, the developers are the worst end users to support. And I would probably acknowledge that security folks are maybe even more difficult to please. But, why is that? A lot of times it's because by the time we seek help, we're 10 miles down the road on what we're trying to do. And when we finally kind of get someone else in, we don't always start with what we are trying to accomplish.
Right.
And so, real cheesy example, if you get in the car, you're turning the key, car won't start. You submit a thing to me and you're like, hey, key doesn't start the car, what do? Well, we have milk in the fridge, or the store is not open, or take the bus, or you're using the wrong key. They're all valid.
Those are all valid answers,
just depending on what you're trying to achieve, right? And it's just rarely ever make the key start this car. That's so rarely the thing that someone actually needs out of a situation. It's almost always, I need to go there and do this thing. And so my approach here has been, in both of these cases, because there's parallels to me, I kind of go back to the original, hey, what are we trying to get out of this situation? In this case, define the control's purpose. And then I would challenge the assumptions of the systems that you're unfamiliar with as an auditor, because those are kind of the unspoken things that are maybe missing in the details between the system and the people who are running it, and then the auditor, right? What are the assumptions that both sides are working on
Right.
about how this is probably working and what it should be actually doing? And then I would verify that the processes match the assumptions that are agreed upon, and then you spot check the process application. And like from an auditor perspective, it's easy to say and very hard to do, but I just don't think that there's another way. You kind of have to take it back to zero.
Yep.
And have the conversation and find the shared ground, and then really figure out, like, are we describing the same thing? Is what I'm trying to get across achieving the same thing as what you're trying to do?
Yeah.
And so, like, PCI example that I think about pretty far too often, because it's just funny to me. But I remember in the early 1.x kind of into 2.0, and I actually don't know if this is still in place, but they came out with a requirement that you had to either have static analysis for your code or a WAF.
Yep.
And I always thought that is such an interesting approach to this, because I don't consider those to be overlapping controls at all. And yet, in this land, like the way that it's been framed, one of these two things needs to solve for X.
Mm-hmm.
And I always had a really difficult problem, like defining what that thing is that both of those overlap with, that they're solving for. Because to me, you need both.
Yeah.
And most of the time, if the WAF is the answer, it should be very short term.
Because a WAF is like, I mean, it can cover for a lot of issues, but it should not cover for a lot of it. Like it's great to have a WAF, but you know what is really great? Secure code.
Right. Yeah. And also, just because you have secure code doesn't mean that there's not some 0 day that you could mitigate in the WAF until you push out a fix.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, both have value and they don't do the same thing. So that to me was always, I remember head scratching on it 10 years ago. I still think about it occasionally.
Yep. That's one of my favorites as well. I also love the one about how many and how complex your password should be when we have, some pretty, NIST is coming out with some information that is wildly different from that recommendation. And so password management is a difficult one. I got asked the other day, hey, what do you think about this passwordless idea, and how are they going to handle it in PCI? And I was like, meh.
Right.
So generally, and I loved what you said, because generally when I'm working with any organization, I assume that they know more than I do about their technology. And I also assume that somebody's missed something somewhere. And so, sure. Like you said, trying to generally, especially if a group is already kind of frustrated with that they have to be in a meeting with me, I'll lay down, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. You tell me how to solve it quickly. Information I need specifically to that, and we're done. Right? It's a conversation, but it requires dropping that ego and listening carefully to things that other people are saying. And I think it requires a little bit of that on both sides.
Definitely. Yeah, there's a lot of adult conversations to be had, which are the most fun ones when you can have them.
Yeah.
The other one that I ran into 2 jobs ago, which I found really interesting, is we had a requirement, and I can't remember the context, but it was essentially a fixed list of assets, right? We needed a spreadsheet that had all of our assets on it. And in a cloud environment, in a dynamic environment,
doesn't mean anything.
I don't think that makes any sense whatsoever. You generate it on demand, and then you audit to make sure that process doesn't leave things behind. And that is a provably better outcome than trying to manually keep some list up to date.
Absolutely.
But yet, a better outcome doesn't necessarily solve for the control as it's written.
Right.
And so that for me was always it's pretty clear that times are changing, the technology is changing, and in many cases, the assurance frameworks are struggling with adapting the language and expectations to kind of wildly different implementation environments.
Yeah, I think it's. I definitely think that compliance is valuable. I've gone back and forth between, the whole statement compliance is not security, and that is true. However, there are quite a few organizations that I work with that wouldn't have a solid security program if they didn't know somebody was going to come in and check their work, right? In some
100%.
way. And so having that compliance there is of tremendous value in order to just kind of kick off that process of having a security program in place that somebody's going to look at, somebody's going to challenge you on. And I do like a lot of the defense in depth aspects of PCI specifically, but of a lot of these the different standards and there is, in the conversation, there is value as long as we stay with what is the underlying purpose. If we threat model basically the current environment and really say what is the underlying potential threat that we're really solving for here, rather than checkboxing. You just go through and checkbox, then everybody's just bored and frustrated, right?
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of things that are the same, the process of threat modeling is the same, right? Like the specifics are different, but the mechanism itself and what you expect from it in terms of visibility into what needs to be protected and from who, that's the same regardless of kind of what model you're looking at in terms of deployment. And those are skills that you build up over a long bit of time. It's really difficult to almost put into words the value of like experience, because sometimes you walk into an organization where your title is supposed to be, a senior type person, but so much of the value of that is the context that you hold on the organization, and you don't have that when you walk in brand new. Right. And so you're ripe for imposter syndrome. But in terms of like kind of being able to talk through a threat modeling exercise, being able to describe how a security program can be run, what the shared language is, what the, why you should have an awareness program rather than just a checkbox that says you have an awareness program. That's kind of where experience and having gone through it before seems to come into play. Mm-hmm. So luckily, a lot of those kind of skills and perspective translate. And then whatever is beyond cloud computing, implantable peer-to-peer net, who knows what in your brainstem, whenever that comes to fruition, I'm sure we'll threat model that as well.
We'll apply what we know to that as well. Well, I feel like I could talk to you for hours. This has been really fun. Chase, thank you very much for talking to me today.
Same. I had a really good time. I love conversations like this. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Take care. Thanks for watching. To watch more episodes of SecurityMetrics podcast, click on the box on the left. If you prefer to listen to this podcast, it's available on all your favorite podcast platforms. See you on the slopes.